Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It's February 13th, 2025, and this is Black Salts with Seth Goldstein, our guest speaker. Before we get into the program properly, just a reminder that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place that the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. Wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. Joining us for our talk today is Seth Goldstein. Seth grew up on Cape Cod, where he developed his passion for maritime history. He has taught at the University of New England, Southern Maine Community College, and the Maine College of Art and Design. He is currently the director of the Cushing's Point Museum at Buglight Park and director of development for the South Portland Historical Society. Seth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you all for joining me on a eventful weather day here in Maine, as weather days can often be. I'd like to start my presentation today regarding Black sailors in Maine and New England to discuss before I do, I forgot. I want to just talk about a couple of terms real quick. I use the term enslaved African as opposed to just slave to remind everybody that the status of being a slave was nothing natural. There was nothing inherent about this status. People were enslaved. This was something that was done to them. This was a status that was forced onto them by other individuals. And so, hence, I very purposely use that term enslaved African. I also will use the term self emancipating enslaved African as opposed to just runaway slave. I feel like the term self emancipating really brings home the gravity of this act, which was a very brave act, which showed a great amount of agency of self emancipating. So I feel like the term runaway slave doesn't necessarily convey the gravity of this act of self emancipation. We're all aware that if you were caught self emancipating, you would be returned to the American South and horrible things would happen to you. So, hence the term self emancipating enslaved African. Now I'll begin uh, with the discussion of New England's African American or Black sailors' roots, and those roots find themselves, not surprisingly, on the coast of Africa, where there were tribes that were specifically known for their boating prowess. For example, the Kru people of modern day Liberia and the Minna of modern day Ghana were both tribes on the west coast of Africa that were known for their boating prowess, and they were extremely adept canoemen. And these individuals would be targeted by European enslavers for that skill set and for that knowledge. So, for example, some of the enslaved Africans who plied boats on the coast of South Carolina in the colonial period had been targeted for enslavement for that knowledge on the west coast of Africa. This is very similar to, you'll see, for example, same period during the colonial period, tribes of Africans who were very adept at growing rice on the west coast of Africa would have been targeted for enslavement for that knowledge and then brought to the southern what would become the southern United States to grow rice there in the colonies at that time. So here we see this is a quote from the Journal of Reverend Thomas Smith and Reverend Samuel Dean. This version published in 1849. You can see this is the year here, 1766. And so Reverend Thomas Smith says in 1766, a Negro belonging to Andrew Symington and a Negro belonging to Wheeler Riggs were fishing in an open boat off Cape Elizabeth, and towards night, the wind coming on fresh blew them off to sea, and the night being excessively cold, it is no doubt but they perished. And so what we see here are two enslaved Africans who are being forced to labor as fishermen. So this was very common in the colonial period, and I have a quote that I'd like to share with you from Lorenzo Green's book, which was published in 1942. Lorenzo Green, uh, Black historian, writing in 1942 in his book *The Negro in Colonial New England, 1620 to 1776*, stated, quote, "In the great maritime industries of New England, slaves were also employed on the fishing, whaling, and trading ships. As early as 1682, an enslaved African belonging to Peter Cross of Massachusetts had so demonstrated his ability as a seaman that he was managing his master's sloop at sea. Reports of accidents, like the accident that's reported here, reports of accidents on board ships further testify to the maritime employment, if not the skill, of the slaves. And then Green goes on in his writing to note that very often enslavers in New England would rent out their enslaved Africans as sailors for voyages. So maybe a voyage of a duration of a couple of 3 months, they would rent out their enslaved Africans and then collect their wages once they returned for from their voyages. This was particularly advantageous to the enslaver who would collect the wages but not have to pay to house and feed their enslaved African over the course of that journey. And just, of course, as long as we're looking at the quote here, Andrew Symington, one of the Symingtons, family from what is today South Portland, who Symington Cove, which is better known today as Willard Beach, is named after this family. Here we see Crispus Attucks. We don't know a lot about Crispus Attucks. In fact, he became popularized during the abolition movement. So, kind of the legend of him grows during the abolition period as he becomes kind of an example of the patriotism and contributions that people of African heritage made to the revolution. But we do know that he was born likely into enslavement in Massachusetts in 1723. Uh, Records indicate he was African and indigenous heritage, and he either freed himself, self emancipated, or was freed in 1750. He then worked as a sailor around the docks of Boston until he was killed on March 5th, 1770, when he was struck by two British musket balls in his chest. Contemporary newspaper articles have him being, quote, born in Framingham, but lately belonging to New Providence, an island in the West Indies, and was here in Boston in order to go to North Carolina. So this is very interesting to me. Here we're starting to see already in the colonial period that this is an individual who's traveling all around the Atlantic world, has a great deal of agency to go where he'd like to go within the Atlantic world, and is connecting these regions, disparate regions of Framingham, Boston, New Providence, and North Carolina. Now, here's a great book that many of you out there might be aware of. It was published, about 25 years ago, Jeffrey Bolster's Blackjacks. According to Jeffrey Bolster, African American men and women found a certain amount of financial as well as social stability working in the maritime trades. Sailors were judged to some degree on how well they, quote unquote, knew the ropes. And I love that term, to know the ropes. Some of you are probably aware. Well, what that means, where that term comes from, is to literally know all of the hundreds of lines of standing and running rigging on a historic sailing vessel. So In the aftermath of emancipation, uh, people of African heritage who had been enslaved in Massachusetts, and of course, Maine is part of Massachusetts, as many of you know, until 1820. It was Massachusetts province of Maine. So emancipation comes here to Massachusetts province of Maine in 1786 after the American Revolution. But people in the wake of emancipation of African heritage are incredibly poor, as you can imagine. They had just been enslaved up until recently. The sea was one of the few avenues for Black people to make good money and to make the same money as their white counterparts. There's no other industry at the time where people of African heritage are making the same money as their white counterparts. And it was because of the nature of the work. It was incredibly dangerous. Black sailors dealt with shipboard racism. They dealt with awful food, poor quarters, sometimes sadistic captains. Um, and so, under those circumstances, if you knew the ropes, if you were good at your job, if you were proficient at your job, that was more important than the color of your skin. And so hence they were paid the same as their white counterparts. Point of interest, many of these Black sailors were older than their white counterparts. Many of them were family men. The white sailors very frequently were younger, single, and hence less dependable, more likely to be drunk, more likely to jump ship in a foreign port, whereas the Black sailors, older, many with mouths to feed, were considered to be more reliable, and this was another reason why they made the same as their white counterparts. So, because they knew the ropes, because they did this incredibly challenging job, they made good money, and because they made such good money, they could buy homes, which was a huge deal. We'll talk in a little bit about Portland's Munjoy Hill community, but these people of African heritage who had maritime employment, not just as sailors, but in related shoreside industries, made enough money they could buy homes. And even today, home ownership is one of the biggest markers of generational wealth that's out there. So this is a huge deal. They're making good money and they're buying homes. And here in Portland, they're buying their homes on Munjoy Hill. Now, Black men sailed before the mast as sailors, but many of them also worked as cooks and stewards aboard ships. Uh, this occurred in part due to preconceived racially based notions that they were good at these jobs as stewards and cooks, that some of them maybe not viewed as capable as white counterparts. So they would work as stewards, they would work as cooks, and this would work out to their advantage as the 1800s went along, as stewards' pay was increased in about the 1840s due to higher expectations regarding shipboard food. So whereas before 1840 they're making in the position of steward or cook less than a common sailor, after the 1840s, stewards and cooks are making more than your average sailor who's sailing before the mast. In some cases, they're making as much as the second mate of the ship. Now, following the Civil War, the status of Black sailors begins to decrease, and they start to be paid less than their white counterparts. So here we can see this is the Portland City Directory from 1844, the people of color section, as you can see. And if you take a look, you'll see that mariner is a very important occupation. So mariner, and then where people live, many of them on Hancock Street, which is on the Munjoy Hill neighborhood in Portland. So mariner, laborer. We can see in the middle of the page the Jacob C. Dickerson hairdresser. He owned a barber shop that we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. But you can see the prevalence of mariner. And sometimes you'll see mariner, and then sometimes it'll say seaman or sailor. And so, I'm curious too as what the difference is. I was talking recently with another historian about this topic. We hypothesized that perhaps seamen were individuals who sailed across the ocean, so transoceanic voyages, and perhaps mariners was used to characterize individuals who were involved in the coastal trade. But once again, you can just see the prevalence of mariner, that it was such an important occupation for Black men and women in Portland in the mid 1800s. And then if we look here, you'll see this is the 1846 Portland City Directory. Once again, people of color section. So just a couple years later. But once again, note the prevalence of maritime related occupations here. Also barber, but mariner, seaman, mariner, laborer, widow, perhaps, lost her husband at sea. So this really testifies to the importance of these maritime jobs, particularly mariner and seaman, for the community of free Black folks who were living in Portland in the mid 1800s. Here we have a quote. This is the Eastern Argus newspaper from the 1840s. Colored owners and crew. The Portland Advertiser says a fine fore and aft clipper built schooner of about 240 tons burthen, not a particularly big ship, called the Jeannette, launched from the shipyard of Macer, Turner, and Harris in Cape Elizabeth, that would today be South Portland, is now rigging at Franklin Wharf in that city. She is owned by Joseph P. Taylor and Eldridge P. Talbot, colored persons, and is to have an entire colored crew with Mr. Taylor for commander and Mr. Talbot the first officer. She is intended for a freighter. So here we have a ship being built in what is today South Portland, expressly built for two men of color, and they intend to outfit this ship with an entire Black crew. Now, the article goes on to say, now, if this schooner should chance to go into Charleston or any other South Carolina port, captain, mates, and all hands would be waited upon by the sheriff and carried off to Gaol, which is how they spelled jail back then, carried off to jail, to be kept in close prison till the vessel sailed, which of course she could never do, so the imprisonment would be perpetual. Can anybody believe that such a law as this is authorized by the Constitution of the United States? And so what's going on here? This is a reference to what were known as Negro Seaman Acts. The first Negro Seaman Act is put on the books in 1822 in South Carolina. And what this stipulated was any free Black sailors coming into a port in South Carolina would have to spend the duration of their time in port in the local jail. And this was in an effort to keep them from coming in contact with enslaved individuals in that state. So the South Carolina has the first one of these Negro Seaman Acts, but other southern states adopt them soon thereafter. So the idea, once again, being that these free Black sailors would in some way communicate to enslaved individuals what was going on. And by their sheer example of existence, these free Black sailors were antithetical to Southern beliefs, and so as an individual of African heritage, you had the freedom to sail anywhere around the Atlantic world. That was an example that white folks in the American South just didn't want their enslaved individuals to even witness. And of course, they were constantly afraid of slave revolts in the American South, particularly after the Haitian Revolution. So they were even referred to as moral contagions. And there was a great book that was published a couple years ago by that name, Moral Contagions, that in some way just the existence, just by existing, that these free African sailors were a contagion to the way of life in the American South. And because this particular ship has an all-Black crew and all-Black officers, they would all be placed in jail in South Carolina, and hence they would never leave. Their incarceration would be perpetual. Black and indigenous whalers, I had mentioned that black sailors paid the same as their white counterparts in the 1800s, you had many whalers who were people of color. And so it's a great book that was published about 3 or 4 years ago by Skip Finley. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. And he discusses this topic. It's a great book, very interesting. Finley estimates that mixed-race individuals, that is, indigenous Americans, free blacks, self-emancipating enslaved Africans, and individuals of mixed race constituted 20 to 30% of sailors on whaling vessels before the Civil War. So, really big percentage, much bigger than their percentage in the general population. And the richest individuals of color, black and indigenous or mixed race, in the United States in the 1800s were whaling captains. You had whaling captains, sometimes sailing with all people of color crews who were making, in terms of today's money, millions of dollars on these whaling voyages. It was the most money that somebody of color could make in the United States at this time. So it was a really big important industry. Um, and then you can see here, this is at the top, the what's known as the Temple toggle. So this was an advent for whaling. Lewis Temple, born in slavery in Virginia around 1800. It's unknown if he was freed or if he self-emancipated, but he arrives in New Bedford in 1829. By the time he invented the Temple toggle in 1845, he owned a prosperous shop on Coffin's Wharf. The Temple toggle, basically, if you take a look at that picture there, there's that hole in the harpoon. There would have been a wooden peg inserted into that hole. And the idea is that when that harpoon entered the side of the whale, entered into the blubber, that little wooden peg would break, and the front of the harpoon would point downwards, would toggle downwards, thereby enlarging itself in the blubber of the whale, making it much more likely that the whale would be caught than the previous harpoons, which were really just very sharp, kind of arrow point like blades. So the Temple toggle has been called the most important innovation in the whole history of whaling. Lewis Temple never sought a patent for his device, but today he's widely recognized as the inventor of it. And as you can see, a statue of him stands in front of the New Bedford Free Library. Here you see this is the Abyssinian Meeting House, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. As I said, you had free black sailors in Portland who are making good money. They're buying homes with that money. And if they had a little bit of money left over, they would contribute to benevolent societies. These were organizations that took care of injured sailors, or if a sailor had been killed or lost at sea, would take care of their families sometimes. And with the little bit of money that they had left over, sometimes they would also contribute to houses of worship. And in this case, in Portland, the house of worship that they contributed to was the Abyssinian Meeting House. I'm sure many of you out there are aware of the Abyssinian Meeting House on Munjoy Hill. It's the country's third oldest African American meeting house. It was the center of Portland's Black community, and hopefully, it's being renovated and restored to its original 1828 condition now. Hopefully, that restoration will be complete in the very near future. The meeting house was known as the Anchor of the Soul, was its nickname, and in part because so many of its members were mariners. Here you can see from the Eastern Argus newspaper the death of Deacon Niles, who was the deacon for the Abyssinian, was also uh, Mariner. And this asserts here that letters had been received in the city by his afflicted family announcing that Abraham Niles, a colored man well known in the city, lost his life by falling down the hold of a vessel from Panama to San Francisco, left the city some months since for California, and had a very hard time out. He leaves a large and dependent family. And so this was Deacon Niles was headed to the goldfields in California. He had taken a vessel down from the East Coast to Panama, traveled overland across the Isthmus of Panama and was taking another boat from Panama to San Francisco when this tragedy struck. Here's another book that I would really recommend. This is Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. And so the author, Timothy Walker, here asserts in his book that, it was virtually impossible to escape from the Deep South overland. You would have been confronted by hundreds of miles of forest and swamp, perhaps being pursued by dogs. It was much more likely that you would attempt to escape by a watery method, very often by stowing away in a southern port. And so that's very often how individuals from the Deep South self-emancipated or attempted to self-emancipate. And the author even cites an example where you have some free black sailors in New Orleans who are loading cotton bales on board a ship alongside an enslaved individual, and it takes them a couple of days to get the boat loaded. But after they have it loaded, the free black sailors say to the enslaved feller, "Hey, there's a spot on deck between the cotton bales. It's just big enough for a person and a little bit of food." So here you have some free black sailors who are sympathetic to the plight of this enslaved individual, and they have an opportunity to help this individual, and they do. So it was opportunistic. I don't think that these were necessarily what we would consider to be conductors on the Underground Railroad, rather a couple of free black sailors who saw an opportunity and took it. And this is how individuals who were self-emancipating very often would wind up in Portland. They would stow away on a vessel in the American South, and then they would wind up in the port of Portland on the waterfront and be connected to the Underground Railroad network here in Portland. Here you can see this is the Portland Freedom Trail. Many of the stops on the Portland Freedom Trail, which I'm sure many of you are aware of the Portland Freedom Trail, it's 16 locations throughout the city of Portland that are specific to Portland's Black community, including the Abyssinian Church, which you can see in the top right there. But you can see there's the Franklin Street Wharf, the Dickerson Barbershop, Lloyd Scott's clothing store. Many of these locations were contributors to Portland's Underground Railroad network. And I do a lot of walking tours of the Freedom Trail, so I'm very familiar with this story, and it's a story that I find very heartening. The community of folks in Portland, free black folks who helped individuals self-emancipate. This is one of the stops on the Portland Freedom Trail, the Franklin Street Wharf. As you can see, is the landing spot for many passengers on the Underground Railroad, individuals who would have self-emancipated by stowing away on a vessel on the American South, and then they would wind up in Portland. Anti-slavery sympathizers were well organized to greet stowaways from Southern cargo vessels, find them safe housing in Portland, supply clothing and passes, and send them on their way to Canada. The wharfs and ships of Portland employed large numbers of African Americans, providing well-paying jobs, thus adding to community stability. And so, that reminds me to share with you that you did have a lot of free black folks who were working as sailors or mariners, but many individuals from that community who were also working in shoreside related maritime occupations like sailmakers, like coopers, blacksmiths, longshoremen, jobs that were also held, boarding house keepers, held by people from Portland's Black community. So you have a self-emancipating individual who would come into the Portland docks. They would hook up with the representatives from Portland's Underground Railroad network. They would be taken to a safe house, likely on Munjoy Hill. The activities of Portland's Underground Railroad would have been probably planned by and large at the Abyssinian Meeting House. This Portland Freedom Trail marker notes the location of the Jacob C. Dickerson Barber Shop, which once stood at 4th Street, 243 4th Street. The interesting thing about 4th Street, of course, is that it used to be right on the Portland waterfront until Commercial Street was filled in. And so I find this fascinating because I think about, well, when I'm doing my tours and I bring people by this location, I'll ask folks, what do you do at the barber shop? And people, well, you get your hair cut. That's true. What else do you do at the barber shop? Well, you talk. And that's exactly what would happen. This was a important nexus of information for a newly forming pan-Atlantic African identity. And so I like to imagine these black sailors coming right off the boats, right? Like right there on 4th Street. They're coming right off the boats and they're going right to the Dickerson barber shop and they're sharing information from all around the Atlantic world. Hey, how's things going with abolition in England? What's going on in South Carolina? What's up in Brazil? As the Haitian Revolution went well, all of this information would have been shared at the barber shop. And so I just love this idea of this kind of, think of these individual black sailors of nodes of information, and this barber shop is kind of like a nexus where all of this information is coming and being shared. Now, you'll note here that another thing that happened at the barber shop was that they had a stock of wigs and fake beards and other facial coverings to change the appearance of a person. And this would have been particularly important after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which was a federal law that allowed for deputies to pursue self-emancipating enslaved Africans into northern states. So whereas before 1850, you're self-emancipating, you make it to a northern state, you would be relatively safe. Following the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, deputies were being paid bounties to return enslaved individuals to their owners in the American South. And in fact, it only took the testimony of one white individual to testify that you were their enslaved property, that you were their enslaved African, and you would be enslaved and sent to the American South, even if you had been free your entire life. You're a free black person in Portland. You've never been enslaved. One white person says, that's my property. That's my enslaved African. You would be sent in enslavement to the American South. This is the plot of that film, 12 Years a Slave. So this is why it would be so important to change your appearance with a wig or a beard or other facial covering. I tell folks on my tours, if you were recognized, and there were newspaper advertisements that were incredibly detailed about self-emancipating enslaved Africans, people trying, owners, enslavers in the American South trying to recover their quote unquote property. Individual this high wearing this kind of clothing has a scar on left cheek, missing part of their ear, walks with a slight limp, etc. So I always tell folks, if you're recognized and captured, you'd be returned to the American South. Horrible things could happen to you. If you could make it to Canada, or England, because they had abolition there a little earlier, you would be free for the rest of your life. And that's why it was so important to change your appearance. The hack stand, Reuben Ruby, one of the leaders of Portland's Black community. In fact, he donates the land where the Abyssinian Meeting House is built, and he donates some of the money to build the Abyssinian. He was, among other things, a hackman, and you can see here a hack is just a horse-drawn taxi, but you had people of African heritage in Portland who worked as hackmen, because this activity lent itself to the Underground Railroad. It was their job to cruise around the city. And so if they were spiriting an individual from maybe the safe house to the barber shop, they would not elicit any suspicion. They were just doing their job, driving their hack around the city. And then you have Lloyd Scott's secondhand clothing store, which is on Exchange Street. Of course, the secondhand clothing store wasn't in the building that you see there on the left because it burned to the ground during the Great Fire of 1866. But secondhand clothing stores, as you can see, were essential to the Underground Railroad, because people could get a change of clothes. Once again, change their appearance, maybe get some warmer clothes if you're headed to Canada. Another thing that happened here at the secondhand clothing shop were that abolitionist pamphlets would sometimes be stitched into the clothing of free black sailors who were headed to the American South, so they could then take that abolitionist literature out and very sneakily give it to enslaved individuals to inform them about what was going on with the abolition movement. Black longshoremen in Portland. Very important job for people of African heritage in the first half of the 1800s. Many of the dock workers up until about 1840 were Black. Many of these original individuals had arrived in Portland through trade with the West Indies alongside cargoes of molasses and rum. A gentleman by the name of William Gould, writing in the Portland Press in 1872, noted that Black longshoremen were known for their singing, which they used when they were timing their labor to work the pulleys to unload cargo. So this would have been what we today call and response singing to kind of gauge the labor. Now, according to Gould, quote, they were sure to have a large audience to hear their singing. Many church-going people on coming out of meeting, so this would have been on Sundays, then took 4th Street on their way home, no matter where they lived. So what he's saying there is that these Black longshoremen, their singing was so beautiful, so lovely that the white folks coming out of church on Sundays would cruise by the Portland waterfront, regardless of where their house was, just for the opportunity to hear these individuals singing. Black laborers on the Portland waterfront pushed out of this occupation when the Irish began to arrive, fleeing famines in 1840s and 1850s. The Black are pushed out of this occupation by Irish longshoremen, and the Irish longshoremen, in addition to using nepotism, hiring their relatives, also form unions, and these unions exclude individuals of African heritage. And so hence, they're pushed out of these jobs, and the longshoremen become primarily Irish, and they're later joined by Italians and immigrants from other nations. Here we see the SS Portland. SS Portland, fascinating ship to me. I study shipwrecks, and I've been studying the SS Portland for a good part of my life. Um, as steamships become more popular in the second half of the 19th century, Black mariners begin to work on the steamships in addition to sailing vessels. People of African heritage worked as firemen, also known as stokers. These were individuals who fed the coal into the boilers for the steam engines. They also worked on board as sailors, stewards, stewardesses, so both men and women of African heritage, porters, and cooks. According to Maine's Visible Black History, the first chronicle of its people, I quote, Black stewards abounded on schooners and steamers. Their work included scrubbing the decks, keeping the oil lamps filled and cleaned, and polishing brass. James E. Addis, who grew up in Machias, reported that his father-in-law, James Weedman of Portland, was a steward for steamers between Boston and Portland for 40 years during the latter half of the 19th century. In Portland, Blacks sometimes left the crews of long-distance steamers and signed on with the Casco Bay lines to be closer to their families. So here you can see this is part of Ayumi Hori, the local artist, her Portland Brick Project, and shows she has worked with the city of Portland to install bricks throughout the sidewalks, uh, mainly in the Munjoy Hill neighborhood, India Street and Munjoy Hill. Here are some bricks that you can see. This is the corner of India and Commercial Street. And you can see in the middle there, on this spot in 1898, the Abyssinian Meeting House tragically lost a third of their congregation, shipwreck of the SS Portland. So November 27th, 1897, the SS Portland sinks in a horrific gale off the coast of Massachusetts. It was like like 100-year storm, what we would maybe call like a perfect storm, although I don't like that term very much. And so they estimate there was about 192 crew and passenger on board, not a single survivor. The entire crew and passengers perish. It's the worst maritime disaster in New England history. In fact, during what became known as the Portland Gale, about 500 individuals throughout the region perished, but almost 200 of them on this one shipwreck, the SS Portland. So when the SS Portland sinks on November 27th, 1898, on board that evening are about 20 individuals from Portland's Munjoy Hill Black community. And because there's only a couple hundred people in this community, oh, sorry, about 400 people in this community, the loss of 20, that constitutes 5%. 5% of their community perishes in this one shipwreck. And you can imagine, that these individuals were the breadwinners for their families. They left behind widows and orphans with very little financial means when they perished. And this was both men and women from Portland's Black Munjoy Hill community. You can see here the picture on the right is Evan Houston, and he was the head steward on board the SS Portland, and he had been a steward on steam vessels for many many years, at least a couple decades. And he had just recently married a woman, Margaret Ann Ball, and they had been married at the Abyssinian Meeting House about a year before this tragic shipwreck. And he was actually returning the night that the ship was wrecked to Portland and to celebrate his 1 year anniversary with his wife. Now, very sadly, Margaret had already known tragedy through the sea. Her first husband, a gentleman by the name of William Ball, who was the father of her two children, had perished when his fishing vessel sank in Casco Bay in 1892. And so, with the sinking of the SS Portland, she now lost a second husband to the sea, and she never remarried. Here you can see this is the Wyoming. So one of those big six-masted schooners that was built in Bath at the very turn of the 20th century. And so, even at this late point in time, steam has taken over a lot of the transport on the water. Even transoceanic voyages by this point in time are being conducted by steam. It's still financially viable to move large bulk cargoes such as coal and lumber by sail. And that's why they're still producing in the early 1900s. I'm sorry, the early 20th century, these large, very large schooner-rigged vessels for bulk transport. And so here's a painting of the Wyoming as it's being finished up in Bath. And if you look at the little top left there, that's what is, it's Bug Light, the lighthouse with the keeper's house still attached, keeper's house taken down in the 1930s, with a large six-masted schooner sailing by possibly the Wyoming. And the reason why I put that up there is because that is the logo for the South Portland Historical Society, for whom I work. So the Wyoming large six-masted schooner, and this is a picture of the crew of the Wyoming. So you can see that, no, this is not the entire crew, I don't believe, but many of these individuals, African heritage. In an effort to keep wages low on coastal schooners in the Atlantic, the Atlantic Carriers Association recruits African American and African diaspora crew members, so African American, but also crew members from the West Indies and Cape Verde Islands, instead of white Union sailors. So, as I said, the status of black sailors kind of declines after the Civil War in the 1860s. They start to become paid less than their white counterparts. Not the case before the Civil War. In fact, you even have some captains who are checkerboarding their crews. This is they would have one half of the crew white half and another half that was black, and they would have separate watches. And this would be an effort to get them to kind of compete against each other. But the important part here is that the black sailors are starting to be paid less than their contemporary white sailors. So white sailors on schooners made about $34 a month, and their black counterparts are paid $5 less a month. Black sailors continue to dominate the coastal schooner trade into the early 20th century. And so here you can see the crew list from the Wyoming. This is 1923, 1924. Looks like the captain. Oh no, these are just seamen. So one seaman from Sweden, a couple from Massachusetts, and then an individual from the Cape Verde Islands, another individual from Cape Verde, South Carolina, Cape Verde, Chile, Puerto Rico, a couple more Swedish fellows, the cook, the bosun, and then finally the last individual, BWI, stands for the British West Indies. So that's the birthplace of these crew members of the Wyoming from the crew list from 1923 to 1924. And then even into the 20th century, shoreside occupations are important for Black folks. This is a picture from World War II era. So you can see Liberty ships, as many of you know, were built right here in South Portland, 276 of them. And so people came from all over the region to build these ships. 30,000 people worked at the South Portland shipyard to produce 10% of all of the cargo vessels built in the United States during the war. And these individuals, as I said, came from throughout the region. Many of them were of African heritage, both men and women. And then so finally we have this picture, which is a great photograph. This was originally published in the Kiel newspaper, the shipyard so big that it has its own weekly newspaper. And this photo, originally published in that newspaper, shows some of the workers at the South Portland shipyard. Pictured, as you can see, Black men and Black women, many of them wearing welding gear. Of course, this is the era of Rosie the Riveter. In South Portland, we had Wendy the Welder because the Liberty ships were welded and not riveted, hence the welding gear. And these individuals are standing in front of the hull of the SS Robert L. Van, the vessel named after Black American Robert L. Van, who published one of the nation's leading Black newspapers at the time, which was the Pittsburgh Courier. So here we have, as I said, men and women, Black men and women working on a Liberty ship in South Portland, a Liberty ship named after a Black man, a newspaper publisher. So that's my presentation for you today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm happy to take some questions at this time.
Thank you so much, Seth. That was really great. And we're getting some great questions from the audience. I'm going to start with this one. Do you know anything about the Black sailors um, who lived on what was called Negro Island at the mouth of Camden Harbor, or about any of those island communities like just off the mainland from Maine?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I know that there were many Negro islands, and we know that because we see them in maps and charts. The best known of these was, of course, Malaga Island, and Malaga Island. I think was very typical of these communities. These were, I shared the information about Malaga Island with somebody who was visiting from out of state this year, and these were individuals who were eking out an existence, lobstering and
Mm,
clamming and fishing. And so the gentleman who I shared this with said, oh, they were basically like sharecroppers of the sea. And I was like, yeah, exactly. These are like
mm,
sharecroppers of the sea. It was, not just, people of African heritage who were living this lifestyle. Many of these islands had, mixed race individuals on board, indigenous and African, sometimes white folks, sometimes mixed white and African. But Malaga Island is a great example, and probably obviously the best known example of what transpired on these Negro islands as far as life and lifestyle that these individuals lived. And we have here in South Portland some descendants from Malaga Island
mm,
who live right here in my neighborhood, who are mixed race individuals today. But some of the when people are forced off of Malaga Island in the early 1900s, some of them wind up here in South Portland, and they continue to work as lobstermen and fishermen. It was very much that was how they existed. That was how they fed their families, and if possible, that was be how they made money as well. So I think that scholarship today would reflect that there were multiple Negro islands off of the coast of Maine, and many of them living this kind of subsistence
Mm-hmm.
lifestyle off of the resources of the sea.
Another question from the audience. Is there anything more known about the Scott family that ran that used clothing store that you were talking about? This individual says they're doing some research on this person. Um, and they found that he was listed in the census between 1800 and 1840 as a free black farmer. His daughter married a musician. So do you know anything more about that family than what you talked about today?
I don't off the top of my head. I think that whoever has done that research is probably doing an admirable job. And I would say that you know more about the Scott family at this point than I do.
Wow. So keep up the good work.
That's right.
So what's next for you, Seth? Oh, actually, wait, hold on. There may be one other question, yeah, that I missed. Have you had a chance to research 1921 in May, the murder of an African American sailor from New Bedford, by rioting by white longshoremen in Portland? This is
Uh,
not a story I'm familiar with.
I haven't had a chance to research, but I have heard of this incident. So I'm familiar with it. I have not had an opportunity to research it yet, but this is not the first time I'm hearing about this incident.
Good to know.
No.
What's next for you, Seth? What are you working on that we should know about? I know we talk about we got to get you in person at
Yeah,
MHS one of these days real soon.
sure.
What are you working on these days?
Well, so variety of things. I'm presenting at the end of this month here in South Portland a lecture on clipper ships, and specifically, I'll be using the Snow Squall, which was a clipper ship that was built here in what is today South Portland, at the time Cape Elizabeth, as my jumping off point to discuss clipper ships generally. And then I am working with the Maine Maritime Museum as an advisor on a exhibit that they're hoping to launch in November, having to do with both Indigenous and Black sailors in Maine. So I'm very excited
Oh,
to be part of
fantastic.
that advisory group. Um, I continue to research and write about the West Indies trade, which, as you
Hmm.
recall, Kathleen, is a topic that I just find fascinating, and I'm uncovering new information all the time. This is kind of the story of Maine's economic complicity in enslavement
Hmm.
in the West Indies, places like Cuba, Barbados, Jamaica, etc. And so, in the course of my readings, I'm always finding new little nuggets related to the West Indies trade, and I hope to publish my findings in the near future.
Fantastic. Yeah, and if you missed Seth's talk with us on the West Indies trade last year, you can find that on demand on our YouTube channel. That was a great program. And don't forget too, visit mainhistory.org. You can find other demand on-demand programs. Sign up for some of our programs that are coming up. And of course, sign up for Maine Connection so that you can stay in the know about everything that's going on in Maine history. Seth, thank you again so much. This was a really interesting and informative lecture. Folks are asking when will this be available on YouTube? Usually takes us about a week or two to get these edited. So probably in early March, I would say end of February, early March 2025, you should be able to find this online. But thank you just for sharing your time and your expertise with us this afternoon.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.